Okay, so in this video, we're continuing our discussion of topic 958, not-for-profit entities, as it relates to subtopic 30, split interest agreements. In the last video, we discussed high level what is a split interest agreement, and generally. And now we're going to discuss more specifically what types of split interest agreements there are. That way we will better understand the entirety of this section. So it says here at subsection 056 that split interest agreements can take several different forms. They can be charitable lead annuity trust, charitable lead unitrust, charitable remainder annuity trust, charitable remainder unitrust, and charitable gift annuities, and then pooled income funds. And each of these has a definition in the glossary, but fortunately for us, they're discussed in more detail individually down here, so we won't need to go to the glossary. But this section also specifies that more scope-related items to dealing with split interest agreements. It says that some of these agreements will allow the donor to revoke their gifts, and then some of them don't allow them to revoke. So they're either revocable or irrevocable, and we will discuss each of those types of agreements in subsequent videos, but just understand that there's agreements that the donors can revoke their gifts and agreements where the donors cannot. And there's a different type of, or way of accounting for each of those. We also have situations where either the donor transfers assets to a third party to manage, for instance, a bank, trust company, or the donor may transfer the assets to the not-for-profit entities to manage the assets. And that may be through naming the not-for-profit as a trustee of the trust that's holding the assets, or granting the not-for-profit the right to hold the assets as its assets of its entity. So in the subsequent sections, we will discuss the different accounting for all of these situations as well. But getting back to the different types of trust, here we have charitable lead trusts, and that could be in the form of annuity trusts or unitrusts. But the commonality here is that they're charitable lead trusts. And what this means is that assets, such as cash or shares of stock, are contributed by a donor to the not-for-profit entity. And that could be where the not-for-profit entity is the trustee or a third party is the trustee. Just the commonality here is that the assets are put into a trust that are paid out in periodic cash payments to the not-for-profit entity. And if there are a fixed dollar amount of cash payments out of the trust to the not-for-profit, then it's an annuity trust. But if it's a specified percentage of the fair value of the assets at the beginning of each period, then it's a unitrust. And so at the end of the agreement, then the remaining assets that haven't been paid to the not-for-profit revert to the donor or the donor's beneficiary. That's the remainder trust. So remember from the prior video, the lead interest is the one who receives the benefits during the term of the agreement. So in that case, the lead interest is the not-for-profit entity. And these lead annuity trusts or lead unitrusts. And annuity meaning it's a fixed payment throughout the term of the agreement, and unitrust meaning that it's a percentage of the assets that's paid out. Now we get down here to the charitable remainder trusts, and just like before, we have the annuity version and the unitrust version. So just like in the charitable lead trust and the charitable remainder trust, we have some assets that were donated by a donor into a trust, and then the trust pays out some payments to a beneficiary throughout the term of the agreement. And just the same as before, the annuity trust is a fixed dollar payments throughout the agreement, and the unitrust is a percentage of the fair value of the assets are paid out periodically throughout the agreement. And what makes this different than the lead trust is that this being a remainder trust means that the not-for-profit gets the remaining assets at the termination of the agreement. So with the lead trust, the not-for-profit got the assets during the term of the agreement, and then with it being a remainder trust, the not-for-profit gets the remaining assets at the end of the agreement. And next we have charitable gift annuities, and that's an arrangement between a donor and a not-for-profit entity in which the donor contributes some assets to the not-for-profit, and then in exchange, the not-for-profit promises to pay a fixed amount for a specified period of time to the donor or to individuals or entities designated by the donor. And so in this case, it's similar to the charitable trust we discussed above, but there's no trust set up. Basically, these assets are sent to the not-for-profit, who records those assets on its books as its own assets, but it also has an annuity liability that it has to pay out periodically over time to the beneficiaries that the donor has designated. Finally, we have a pooled income fund. So these are basically funds that are set up by many, maybe not-for-profits, many donors have contributed funds to these pooled, or these have contributed assets to these pooled income funds that are invested as a group. So the not-for-profit, rather than investing each of the contributions separately, puts them all together in a single fund and pulls them together. That way it's more efficient to invest them together as a group. So now that we understand the different types of vehicles through which not-for-profit set up split interest agreements, we can, in the next several videos, understand how do we record each of these different types of situations, and how do we disclose them, and how do we measure the amounts and balances in the financial statements.